This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. An end of the summer best of from me. Going back into the archives, pulling forward three very smart people, three very different people. Jason Fried, Jack Horner, and Brett Steenbarger. Jason Fried, one of the founders of Basecamp. I actually knew him before Basecamp. Actually worked with him on one of my websites. What a small world. Second up today, Jack Horner, who is the paleontologist, dinosaur guy, who was the inspiration for the Jurassic Park films. That's very cool stuff. I was very fortunate to get him on this podcast. In fact, I need to ask him for part 2. And coming up last today, a trading psychologist, I think is the best way to describe him, or just trader, but a very, very smart psychological perspective. That's what he's known for, Brett Steenbarger. Three great voices, all intertwined in a way that you might not see, but I see. They made their thing happen. They did it. Props to them. Big applause. And if you can't learn something from these three men, there's something wrong with you. If you can't take what they're saying and how they say it, the tone they say it, even if it's something different than you do, if you can't learn a lesson for your life, again, there's something wrong with you. Now, come on, I won't beat you up too much on this last few days before the summer ends, but take my wisdom to heart. Listen carefully. And if you have any questions, if you would like to ask me anything about trend following, I'm easy to reach. Michael@covel.com. I will send you a free video that gives you the trend following introduction. Again, really easy to reach. Michael@covel.com. Without any further delay, let's jump right into Jason Fried, Jack Horner, and Brett Steenbarger. Enjoy. Today on the show, I have Jason Fried. He's the founder and CEO of Basecamp, formerly known as 37 Signals. He's the co-author of Getting Real, Rework, and Remote. I personally love Rework. If you have not read the book Rework, go read the book Rework. I've looked forward to having Jason on for a long time because actually I've known Jason for a long time. Now, not really huge personal no, but Jason worked with me as a web developer in like 1999 or 2000 before he became world famous, massively successful CEO with Basecamp. So just kind of a cool story for me to watch this guy just go from being a web developer, really good web developer, to this massive success. Awesome story. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hey, listen, let me give you a little intel on the book Rework. Okay. So I'm in Saigon, and yeah, there's not many business books that are translated into Vietnamese. I'm probably 4, 5, 6 authors. You, Malcolm Gladwell. I can't even find Daniel Kahneman's book, but I see Rework everywhere where I see translated U.S. business books in Vietnamese.
That's cool. Yeah, our publisher's really been on top of getting it. I think it's in like 20-something languages now.
Yeah, but it's a real tough one over here for some of the Vietnamese translations, but I thought it was pretty cool. So listen, let me jump in right away because I only got you for a little while. Your first dollar you made online, what year was it? What did you sell? And what did making that first dollar online do to you?
Gosh, I'm trying to remember the year. It was when I was, I think, a senior in high school or something like this. So this was graduated high school in 92. So maybe let's call it early 90s. I don't know exactly the year, but I had made this piece of software called AudioFile, which was a FileMaker Pro based database to keep track of your music collection. I had a bunch of CDs and tapes and stuff at the time, and I was loaning them out to friends, and I wasn't getting them back, and I forgot what I had, and I just needed a way to keep track of the stuff. So I made this thing, and I put it up on AOL. So this was actually before the internet, but it was online still. So dialed in on my modem to AOL, put it up on AOL in the files section somewhere, and included in the README file something saying, if you like this, send me $20. And that summer, one summer, again, I don't remember the exact year, but I got an envelope in the mail. I was still living at home, and it was from Germany. It was one of those airmail envelopes with the blue and red sort of checks at the top of the envelope. And I'm like, I don't know anybody in Germany. And I opened it up, and someone had printed out the README with a $20 bill, US $20 bill, saying, I love your software. And that was the first time I ever made money selling software and selling something online. It was old school, and that someone sent me cash, actually, in the mail. In airmail, but it was amazing because for the first time I realized that I can make something that other people want and they're happy to pay for it, and I don't even have to know who they are, and I can just put it somewhere and people will find it, and all these different things, and I think that really changed me, and I'm glad I grew up around that time where people were really happy to pay for things that they really liked, because it reminded me that that's how business works. It's not about giving everything away for free and hoping someday, one day, maybe you'll turn the lever or flip the lever and flip the switch and people start paying you. But really, the people are happy to pay for goods and services that they really value.
And what's amazing about that is that I could see some critics, they might say, well, Jason, yes, this is great and all well. You're the CEO of Basecamp today, this highly successful business. But here you are, 15, 16 years ago, mapping out almost verbatim the same type of attitude that you mapped out in Rework.
Yeah. It's all just simple stuff. It's not, none of the stuff is complicated. It's basic business 101 stuff, which is make something that people are happy to pay for, treat people well, make it good, make it affordable. Like, it's just basic stuff. It's the kind of stuff that every business has to live if they want to stay in business. And I just don't think you have to get incredibly fancy and complicated with this stuff. Business is a relatively simple concept. It's not easy, but it's fundamentally a simple thing until you make it really complicated. And then it's hard, and then it's extra hard, and then it gets really weird. And then you're making up excuses and you're tracking things that don't matter and all the stuff, when really it's just about, can you make something that's great that people are happy to pay for? And if you can do that and you treat them well and you take care of them, then I think you can build a nice solid business. You don't need, not every business has to be some $1 billion business that has 20,000 employees. You can build a great little small business that takes very good care of you and your employees and your customers, and that's a wonderful, wonderful thing.
But the unique aspect there for you, though, is taking advantage of this new medium, this internet communication, plus the software skills. So you're right, it's old school business, but you're tapping into two big new things, essentially.
At the time, I didn't know what I was tapping into. I was just making something that I needed and putting a price on it and putting it out there and saying, if anyone else out there in the world needs this too, hey, I put some work into this, pay me $20 for it. And that's all it was. And really that's all it still is today, which is that at Basecamp, we make Basecamp, and Basecamp's a tool that we use every day. And we're basically saying, we make this thing that we use every day. And if any other business out there needs something like this, pay us for it. We'll take care of you. You take care of us. Like, we'll keep making this thing better as we have for the past 10 years. And, let's do business. And it's the same theory as I've always had. And I just believe in it.
And you're trying to make something more valuable than the dollars that people give you.
I think that's what you have to do, because I think exchanging money is a really intimate thing, actually. And I don't think people think about this enough. After family and friends and love and these things, like, giving someone $1 is a big deal, because it's basically, someone had to work for that $1. They had to put in their time. They had to sacrifice their own things to have this $1 that then they're giving to you in exchange for something you're giving back to them. It's a really intimate exchange, really. I take that seriously. When we ask people for money, I know, like, this isn't just free. No one has free money. They had to work for this money. They had to get this money. They're making a sacrifice. They're not spending this money on something else. I have to make sure that what I'm giving them is more valuable than what they're giving me. I just really feel like that's It's critical. I mean, for a short period of time, you can survive cheating people. Certainly you can do that. Lots of businesses out there do that, but that's if you're only interested in being around for a few years or a few months. You know, if you're interested in being around for a long time, which I am, you have to treat people well. And I think one of the best ways to do it is to give them more than they're giving you. And that's sort of how we do it.
And I think what's interesting too is that for the audience out there, they should recognize that you're not talking about raising capital from someone else. You're not talking about an exit strategy. And I relate highly to what you're saying because I started catering to clients in 96 online. So while we were all kind of growing up in the dot-com bubble, hearing these stories that, oh, you must raise money from some unknown mythical third party, and then you just get staff and you outfit an office and all this other stuff. It used to make no sense to me because nobody was making money. And I kept thinking to myself, well, I'm actually making money. Wasn't that the goal of the whole process?
Well, it's funny is we do raise money from our customers. Like that's how we raise money.
Yeah.
And that's you have to raise money from somewhere, because other people need money from you. You got to pay the bills. You got to have payroll. So where do you raise it from? We've chosen to raise it from our customers by selling them something. Other companies will choose to raise it from investors. Other companies will choose to raise it from banks or whatever they have to do. We just do the simple thing, which is we try and make something. People pay us for it. And that's where we get our money from. And I just think it's just such a more direct point of view, and it's more sustainable long term. It's all the things that I think really matter. Again, I have to stress, if you want to be in business for a long time, because a lot of people don't. A lot of people don't want to be in business for a long time. They want to be in business for a short time, try and sell their business so they can start another business and then flip that and start another business. And that's entirely a fine model if that's what you're into, but it's not what I'm into. I'm into building something for the long term because those are the things that I really admire. I admire businesses that have been around for a long period of time. I admire buildings that have been up for 150, 200, 300 years. I admire old oak trees that are 400 years old. Like that's the kind of stuff I love. I'm a lot less interested in stuff that's thrown up really quickly that's going to fall apart in 10 years. Like that just doesn't interest me. So I don't want to build a business like that. I want to build a lasting business.
You know, I've got about 5 or 6 kind of key points that I've pulled from your life and your writings that I just love. And I think one of the things that just strikes me, and I'm not necessarily great at it, but do less than your competitors to beat them.
Yeah. This is something that is counterintuitive, especially in our industry, which is tech and software, where everyone's trying to do everything, do more and more and more. My general feeling is that most people don't need a lot of stuff when it comes to software. Like people have relatively simple problems that they need help with. And software is really good at helping people with that kind of stuff. And you don't need to make things incredibly complicated, and things don't need to do 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 100 different things. They need to do a few things really well, because that's really what people need fundamentally. Now, everyone might need different versions of those things, and that's why there are lots of different products that do very similar things but do them in different ways. But we've always chosen just to do a few things really well and try and get those things right and nail that stuff and make it really clear and really accessible, so just about anybody can figure out how to use Basecamp, compared to a lot of other tools where they might in the end do a lot more than Basecamp, but people won't even get to that point because they're too complicated and too complex. So I think you can underdo the competition. And when you look out there at the world, you don't have to feel like you have to outdo everybody. You can underdo, especially when everyone else is trying to do so many things.
You know, this is not necessarily a new thought from you. It's a great thought, but it's not necessarily new from you. I'm curious, do you still have people that will come to you with the suggestions of how you should change and how you should augment your product to how they see it and some new nuance and whatnot? Does that still happen?
Oh yeah, it happens all the time, and it's fine, and I expect it to happen. I mean, everyone has their point of view and their opinion and their suggestions, and in many cases, we listen to all of them. In some cases, we do some of them because they make sense, and they're things we hadn't thought of, or they're points of views that we hadn't entertained before, or there's a scenario that we hadn't considered. We absolutely listen to all those things, but it's our job as the people who make the product to sort of build something on behalf of the entire customer base rather than build things for individual customers. Because when you start building things for individual customers and you start adding those things to products, if 1,000 people have 1,000 different points of view, you end up with a really muddled, complicated, confusing product. And we have to maintain the overall point of view for the majority, which is that people come to Basecamp because they want a simple tool that works. They've tried many things that have made many promises that don't work. They're too complicated, too complex. They couldn't get other people to use it with them. And so they come to Basecamp because they've heard that Basecamp just simply works. Yeah, it doesn't do everything. It doesn't do all the things that everything else does, but it does the few things that they need. It does it really well. And, while, like I said, while we listen to all the suggestions and some of them do make it into the product, we have to keep in mind why people fundamentally come to us, which is that they need something that's really simple, that's concise, that's clear, that works.
Talk about building an audience, because I think even before you became really well known for Basecamp and prior incarnations of 37 Signals, I remember the old 37 Signals manifesto and those points and that simple one page of HTML, which I think can still be found out there somewhere.
Yeah, it's 37signals.com/manifesto.
But that, I'm assuming from your perspective, was part of laying the foundation of building an audience, even before you knew exactly how some of these products, you didn't have a plan. You didn't know that Basecamp was going to be this baby that was going to take off, but you were still laying a philosophical foundation to build an audience.
Yeah, I think, it comes down to what's your point of view and are you willing to be public about it and share it? I think in business, a lot of companies are afraid to be themselves and afraid to say what they believe. And because of that, customers have a hard time understanding the difference between one company and another. I've always believed that companies should have points of view and they should be vocal about them because I want to know where they stand. I want to know who I'm buying from. I want to know who I'm investing in as a customer. And so we've always just had a strong point of view. And we've never been afraid of sharing it. So the original 37 Signals manifesto site was 37 ideas and points of view about how we saw the industry, how we saw our work, what we thought was important about design and whatever. Rather than showing our work, which is what everyone else was doing, we were showing our ideas, which is what no one else was doing. And by doing that, we certainly upset some people. Some people didn't understand what we were doing. Like, how can you have a web design business and not show work? And the answer was, we'll show you our work after we show you our ideas. And if you like our ideas, then we're probably then let's talk and I'll show you our work. But if you don't like where our point of view and where we're coming from, there's no point in me showing you our work because we're not going to get along. So that was the idea. As far as building the audience, it was just, I think when you have something to say, especially when it's something that's non-conventional at some level, especially these days, an audience will find you. But it takes a lot of time to build an audience, and it takes commitment, because there's a lot of lonely days where no one's looking. You have to be, I think, committed to continue to publish and continue to share, and eventually I think the audience will find you.
I still remember back in the day when I was looking for a web designer, probably in 99 or 2000, and I started to search for usability because I just realized there was something wrong with all the designers that I was dealing with. And there was one lonely operation in Chicago that I could find on a search under the phrase of usability. One operation was taking that term. So
it wasn't really something people talked about that much back then. And I think the main reason why is because back then, a lot of the web design firms were like graphic design or advertising agencies that were beginning to get into web design. And the advertising agencies and design agencies never really thought about usability before because that wasn't their business. For me, coming from a different point of view, which was I made software first, I understood what usability was and why it mattered. And so I wasn't repurposing one business into another. I was just becoming this new business based on, understanding what's required when designing something. It's about being clear and usable and accessible and those things. And so it made sense to me. It wasn't a buzzwordy thing. I don't even think people are using the word that often. It just was like, I want this to be usable. I want to be able to use this thing. This isn't about something I'm just looking at. It's about something I'm using. So it's got to be usable.
It was definitely not a buzzword thing that you guys were doing, but it was how I initially started to learn about your work. Let me jump around on you a little bit more here. So the real world, it's even back to the MTV title, the real world. The real world is what you make of it. And I think sometimes I see these constraints out there that people have. I can't do this. I can't do that. I look at your world in particular and I say, wow, there are MBA programs out there. And I unfortunately spent 2 years in an MBA program when I should have been learning software. But there are MBA programs out there that are probably talking about your business as a case study. And what's so interesting about that is that I don't think that's where you develop. That's not how you came along. And it's interesting that I think sometimes we get this backwards on how, I mean, if you're inspired by a Jason and you're inspired by Basecamp, maybe you're not trying to duplicate or emulate them, but if you're inspired, I don't know how that inspiration really, how does it continue and how does it grow inside an MBA program? It seems like you're almost a tinkerer, you're a scientist, you're playing around with things, you're experimenting, you're trying, you're guessing, you're not planning. How do you get that in an MBA program? I don't know, and I've got an MBA.
Well, MBA programs are, I've spoken at a handful of business schools to MBA students. What I've come to realize is that MBA programs aren't for people who want to start their own business for the most part. MBA programs prepare you to go work in an existing business or be a management consultant or something like that, or jump in at a really big company, because almost all of the concepts taught in MBA programs are not really about being scrappy. It's never about being scrappy. It's never about tinkering. I shouldn't say never, but rarely about tinkering, rarely about being scrappy. It's all about balance sheets and income statements, which don't matter at all on day one when you've just got an idea and you want to make something. Like those things matter eventually, certainly, but that doesn't matter right now. And even like risk management and all these, none of that stuff matters when you just have an idea and you want to make something. It just doesn't matter yet. And I think those programs are valuable if your interest is like going to work at Accenture or going to work at a management consulting firm or becoming a CFO or a COO somewhere in some other place and working your way up the chain and understanding corporate America and that stuff. I'm not suggesting that there's nothing valuable at all taught in MBA programs. That's not true. There's lots of valuable things, but they're not applicable to being scrappy and running something out of your house and trying to get your first customer. That's the kind of stuff you need to know how to do. And that's not stuff that's really taught in schools.
Yeah, because it's kind of inverted. We all look to something like Steve Jobs and Wozniak in a garage, and we all kind of know they started in a garage, and then somehow or another it gets flipped that the vast majority of students think, well, forget the garage. Let's go get to the MBA program. And I'm not trying to be super critical of it either. I'm just pointing out that, from an entrepreneurial, being scrappy standpoint, inventing, creating, some of those voices don't necessarily help.
Right. I think they can throw you off. I mean, I've run into a whole bunch of entrepreneurs or want to be entrepreneurs, people who haven't, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I mean, people who are in school and they want to start a business when they leave school. And the first thing they start thinking about is what they've been taught in business school, which is, I need to go raise money. I need to build up a team. I need to hire a CFO and hire all these C-level executive type people when, man, it's just you. You don't need you can't be a chief executive of anything when there's no one else. You don't need all these levels of hierarchy. You don't need this traditional business stuff. People are obsessed with, I need which corporate structure should I get into, and what's the difference between S corp and a C corp and an LLC. And I go, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter right now. Just make something. Just make something. And even if you have to first start out by having a checking account in your own name and not a business name, that's fine. Just do that to start. Just sell something. Sell your first thing to someone. And then make something and sell it to someone. And once you have your first customer and your second customer and your third customer, eventually you can worry about all the legal little details and all the other things that you might need to deal with. But right now, none of that stuff matters until you have something you can sell and that you actually have sold something. I know that's always been my point of view. I remember when I first started doing web design, I think I got my first client and I didn't have a business name. And the guy's like, who do I make the check out to? I'm like, just make it out to me. I don't know. It was $600, my first web design job. Just make it out to me. In fact, you might even know the guy, Tim Knight, who
yes, it was
ran Profit Data.
Yeah. Really? That was your first client? Seriously?
Yeah, he's my first client. So
wow.
I pitched him on something. He hired me, and the first little web design gig was $600. And he's like, how do I pay you? I'm like, I don't know, just write me a check. And I got this check. And I'm like, great. And I was in business. But I didn't have to worry about was I an S corp or a C corp and who, all this stuff and all, do I need a board and all that. I didn't need any of those things. I just needed to sell something. And I could worry about all the other stuff later. But if you go through a traditional business school education, you would never think that way because you've been indoctrinated to think that you need all this structure and all this formality. Business doesn't have to be that way, especially at the start. Eventually, yeah, you got to get your stuff in order or whatever, but that just doesn't matter on day one.
Let me shift a little bit on you. So the idea of people out there listening and they've got some thought in their head and they want to create something, but they're stumbling, they're bumbling, they're not making progress. And I've seen you say, focus on what will not change.
Yeah, this is advice I got from Jeff Bezos, actually. So Jeff Bezos, actually, he's the only person who's ever invested in 37 Signals from the outsides or Basecamp. In 2006, we sold a really small piece of the company to him. I can go into the details on why later. But anyway, so Jeff's given us a lot of advice. And one of the things he told me is, everyone else is focused on the next thing, the next hot thing, the next moving target. He goes, you got to figure out the things in your business that are not going to change and continually invest in those, because those investments will pay off in the near term and the long term, and they'll keep paying off. So for the example he gave me was, take Amazon. People are not going to wake up 10 years from now and wish Amazon had a worse selection. Like, they don't want that now, and they're not going to want that in 10 years from now. So we should invest in a very broad selection of products. People are not going to wake up 10 years from now and go, I wish Amazon's delivery was slower. They don't want that today, and they're not going to want that in 10 years. So how can we continue to invest in, in his case, it'd be more distribution centers, faster shipping, better shipping deals, Amazon Prime, all that stuff. How can we get people things faster? That's going to benefit them today and forever. Right. And so in our business, what are the things that people aren't going to want or aren't going to wake up 10 years from now and wishing we didn't have? So for example, people aren't going to wake up in 10 years and say, I wish Basecamp was a lot slower. So we invest, and no one wants that today, and they're not going to want it in 10 years. So we invest heavily in infrastructure improvements to make sure that we're cutting milliseconds of time off everywhere we possibly can. So the Basecamp experience is as fast as possible today and tomorrow. People aren't going to wake up in 10 years and go, I wish Basecamp was harder to use. Like, no one's going to say that now, and they're not going to say it in 10 years. So we're focused again back on simplicity and clarity and just nailing the basics and that kind of stuff. And I think that's just such great advice. It doesn't mean you shouldn't pay attention to other things as well, but you got to get the fundamentals and the basics right. It's something that a lot of companies ignore, and I think they pay for it down the road.
I've seen you say that Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is your favorite book. I have it on my shelf. I've not yet read it. Okay, I've read several Alan Watts books recently, but I must, without having not read that book, I know it's one of Phil Jackson's favorite books.
I've forgotten why I like that, to be honest. It's been so long.
Well, the word Zen is in it, so let's start there. Okay, so clearly the moment of right now, if I was to ask you, what are you planning to do 5 years from now or 10 years from now? I think you might answer the question if you've got like some wide distribution CNBC reporter. You might answer the question, but in the back of your mind, you're thinking, why did you just ask me what I'm going to be doing 5 years from now or 10 years from now? Because I don't know, because I'm in the moment of right now. Am I completely off base?
No, that's right. I don't know, and I don't care, right? Because whatever I say, I'm going to be wrong. What am I going to be doing in 10 years? I have no idea. And I promise myself, I promise you and your listeners and everyone else that pretty much anyone who says that, like, if anyone sits there and actually takes stock of things and go, what am I going to be doing in 10 years? And they look back on their answer in 10 years, they're probably going to be wrong almost every single time. If I would have done that at every step of the way, I would have been wrong every time. I didn't know when I launched AudioFile way back in the early 90s, I didn't know I'd be doing web design in 5 years because the web didn't even exist. And then when the web came around, I didn't know I'd be doing Basecamp in 7 years because like web-based software didn't really exist and software as a service didn't really exist. I didn't know. And then we built a bunch of other products. And then I didn't know one day that I'd go back and just do Basecamp, just focus again on Basecamp. I didn't know we'd have 45 people in the company. I thought we'd always be a 20-person company. When we were 10, I thought we'd never be 20. Like, I don't know. Who knows? So I don't worry about things like that because it doesn't matter. I'm trying to stay as focused as I can on the moment. And, I have to look ahead a little bit, and you should. I mean, I'm not totally a day-to-day person, but I'm not worried about what things are going to look like in 5 years because I just don't know. And I don't think anyone knows. I mean, especially in this industry where things are moving so quickly, it's just, you just don't really know. So, and I think it's okay to wait and see. Some companies will lose because they wait and see, certainly, and that we could be one of them. But I think if you just keep trying to predict the future and stuff, it's just such a moving target. It's not even worth doing. I think you got to pay attention to right now for the most part. And that's what you can control. Every day out from now is harder and harder to control. And to a certain point where you get far enough out, you have no control, unless you're one of the very, very, very few people and companies who truly are redrawing the future. There's really, a handful of them in the world out of a zillion companies that exist. So it's pretty rare that you're going to be one of those. And if you're not, I wouldn't worry too much about it.
I have one last question for you, but I thought before I asked that, you brought it up, and I don't know if you want to elaborate, if the audience would find it interesting, if it's an interesting story. You mentioned Jeff Bezos, and I didn't know if there was some background or color there that is inspirational for other people. I don't know if you want to elaborate or.
So we launched Basecamp, the product, in 2004, and it had been doing pretty well. And 2006 came around. In the first couple of years, we'd been approached by a variety of venture capital firms. And I've always been someone who said, I don't want external money because first of all, we didn't need it. Our customers were paying for things. They were generating more revenue than we needed, so we had nice profits and everything was great. And I didn't want it. I don't want to be on someone else's time frame, which is typically what happens when someone invests from the outside. They want you to sell or IPO or something because they want their money back, which makes sense. And I just didn't want it. But then one day, someone from Jeff's office called us, and I admire Jeff hugely. I think he's one of the smartest entrepreneurs in the world, maybe the top CEO in the world today. Anyway, fascinating guy, and to get to meet him was sort of an amazing moment. So I said, sure, I'll fly out to Seattle and meet with Jeff about this. Jeff had heard about us because I think a couple of the companies he'd invested in had used Basecamp. We also designed a website for a company that he'd invested in. So I think there's some triangulation. I think he heard me speak somewhere at a conference, and it just sort of all these things came together, and he wanted to meet us. So I flew out to Seattle, fully not intending to take money from him at all. But we had a really great conversation, and I really, really liked him, and I felt like we could really benefit a lot from him. Most of the VCs and investors who'd hit us up weren't business people. They're business people, but they weren't entrepreneurs. They hadn't started a business. They're not running a business currently other than their investment firm. And Jeff was a CEO, alive and well, running a business, building a business, started from scratch just a few years before that. He'd gone through the things that we thought we were going to be going through. And so through a variety of, we negotiated and stuff here and there. And ultimately in 2006, we decided to sell a small piece of the company to him. Now, these were founder shares, basically, which meant that it was not an investment in the company. He didn't put money into our company. What he did was he bought a piece of the company from me and David, my business partner. So it was money off the table for David and I. So we could take a little bit of risk off the table early on because we had no idea if this thing was going to work. It worked for 2 years, but could it go away in 3 years and 2 years? Absolutely. So let's take a little bit of risk off the table, have a little bit of comfort, a little bit of a buffer, and then we can just get back to focusing on the product again so we don't have to struggle through it all. It's been great. We talk to Jeff maybe once or twice a year, or his people. We don't talk to him very often. He's available to us if we have really important questions that we need to ask him, and occasionally we do. But for the most part, he's given us some early advice. He's there. He's an ear if we need his. He'll give us opinions and points of view if we ask. But part of the deal was he doesn't have a controlling stake in the company. We don't have a board of directors, so he's not on the board of directors. It was not a typical investment where an investor comes in and they have all this control over you and they can force you to do this and force you to do that. That's not how the deal went, because that's not what we wanted, and that's not what he wanted either. He's got a million other things going on in his world that we're pennies for him ultimately. So
it's almost like he saw something that you might not have seen, and it was almost like he wanted to inspire you, it sounds like.
Yeah, he does this occasionally, I think, where he finds companies he likes. He likes their point of view. He likes that they're doing something differently. They're a little radical or whatever. And I think he likes to support those kind of companies. So in many ways, it was support, but he's also a very astute investor, and he's not just giving away money. So, we're an LLC structurally, so we pay off dividends every year to the owners of the company, and he's a partial owner. So he gets money every year as long as we're profitable, and we have been profitable ever since we've been in business. So he's actually getting his money back all the time. So it was a smart investment for him, very smart investment financially. And also, it wasn't an investment that takes any of his time. So I think it was a real win for him, too, and we feel good about it as well.
So this is kind of for the audience out there, those people out there that are sitting back, they've got ideas, but they're not executing ideas. And I've seen you talk about the notion of planning versus guessing. And planning doesn't really do much. Guessing is where we're at. But even bigger picture than that, I've seen you talk about winging it. You're talking to a guy who's done a lot of winging, okay? So I'm right there with you at the winging. And I mean, I live for the winging. But talk about winging it, because winging it is, gosh, if there's ever a secret sauce when you think you don't have anything, winging it is part of that sauce.
I feel like it's okay to have no idea what the hell you're doing. And I feel like the truth is most people don't have any idea what they're doing. I think it's easy to look in, especially as an entrepreneur or a wannabe entrepreneur, someone who hasn't started something yet, and look at all these businesses and look at all these role models and think that these people have it all figured out, that they are all so smart, they've got it all figured out, they've sit there and toiled and labored over all these individual decisions, and they plan it all out, and it's working just as they thought. I think the truth is that very few people have any idea what they're doing, that we're all figuring this stuff out as we go, and that's entirely okay, and the people should understand that as someone who's never started a business, you're not that far off from someone who has. It's very hard to replicate this success. And sometimes it's about timing, and sometimes it's about making one right decision here and there. And sometimes it's luck, and sometimes it's a mistake that works, and you just don't know. And it's totally fine just to figure things out as you go. You do not have to have this stuff figured out. I feel like a lot of people are afraid to start because they feel like they don't know what step 2 would be, or they don't know what the next deal would be. And like, you figure it out as you go, and it's fine. It's totally fine. Don't worry about it. That's the advice I always give people. And I feel like there's just a lot of fear built up and risk built up around businesses. And I understand where that comes from, but I just don't feel like it has to be this terrifying thing where you feel like you've got to have it all figured out, or you are not a good business person, or you're not a good leader, or, you're not going to build something successful. I don't know. Just make something great and treat people well and get the word out about it, and do it right, and have good morals, and be someone of integrity, and like, things are going to be okay. I think for the most part, it doesn't mean it's always going to work. There's many things that don't work, but just figure it out as you go, and you'll be fine.
The books, Rework, Remote, Getting Real. Jason, everybody can find you at basecamp.com. Is there anything else I'm leaving out?
No, you can also find me on Twitter, Jason Fried, Fried. That's just one word on Twitter. You can get me there. Yeah, that's it. It's fun. I want people to do well, and I just want people to realize they don't have to drive themselves completely crazy trying to run a business.
I think what people loved about Rework, and I know for me, is it was the things that I was living, but I was not astute enough to write down. So as I was going through those experiences, and I'm sure that's why the book has been such a bestseller, is that so many people lived it, but they couldn't enunciate it. They couldn't write it down. Then when they saw your words, like, oh, damn, that's what I believe. That's what I've been doing.
Right. That's the funny thing about, so we hear from people who've read Rework all the time, and they email us, because at the end of the book, we have our email address in there. And one of the things we realize, or we hear from, the type of person we hear from a lot, is someone who is so thankful that they're not alone, that they read the book and they're like, yes, this is what I've always felt, but I thought I was crazy because everyone told me you can't do it this way. And I had been on this island thinking I've been doing it wrong this whole time. And oh my God, I realized that now I had not been doing it wrong. That in fact, you can make things up as you go, and you can be scrappy, and you can not have any clue about things, and you can not have to be incredibly formal. Like I've been doing it this way. I didn't know it was okay. And now I feel great about it because I know it's okay. So we hear from so many of those people, and it's really great to hear from them, because I've often felt the same way. Like when I explain like how we run our business to other people, some people think I'm nuts. And like at a certain point when enough people tell you you're nuts, you're thinking to yourself, maybe I am. Like, am I nuts? Really? But really, I'm not. I'm just trying to do something basic. And
yeah, but even if you were nuts, it's more fun being a little nuts than just not nuts, right? So
that's true too. That's true too. So maybe everyone who does things this way is nuts, but at least it feels good to know there are other people who are nuts too.
Indeed.
And that feels great. So
hey, listen, thank you for taking the time today, and hopefully we can talk again in the future.
That'd be fun, man. Thanks again. Good to hear from you again.
Today on the podcast, I have somebody quite different than my world. Jack Horner. Jack is a paleontologist. He's a world-renowned paleontologist. Jack was the technical advisor for all of the Jurassic Park films. What you see, down to the level of science, the best that his work could bring forward is reflected in the Jurassic Park films. You might say, Mike, why do you want to have Jack Horner on your podcast? Well, for one, I have a life-size skull replica of a T-Rex in my office. That's pretty cool. Jack has written a book on T-Rexes. So there's my personal reason. The reason for you, the audience, though, even if you don't like dinosaurs, is to listen to how Jack Horner thinks, to also go watch his TED videos, to look at his research. He talks about it in my podcast. He's dyslexic. He talks about the process of learning. Think about the words that he uses: opportunistic, scavenger, devil's advocate, talking about science, the idea of comparing, constant comparisons, and ultimately challenging the status quo. Of course, I relate to all of those aspects because that's my life too. A different field, but same attitude. Outside the system, challenging the status quo. And guess what? The status quo does not like to be challenged. They don't like to have their sacred cows lanced and let to bleed out, so to speak. So this is why I wanted to have Jack Horner on the podcast. I think it's pretty awesome. He was essentially the character Alan Grant in the films. It was derived from his traits, his work, etc. Very cool. I hope you enjoy. Well, listen, before I jump into this, I want to go back to some of your early upbringing, because I think a lot of your lessons and how your career has unfolded apply much more than just paleontology. And I think maybe if you wouldn't mind starting for me, the fact that here you are, you've risen to the highest echelon in your field, very well respected. You have figured out things about dinosaurs that no one else had ever figured out. And we'll talk about that. But you did this coming as an outsider. You did this without the requisite degree.
Well, I'd gone to college. I mean, I spent 7 years in college, so I at least knew something, but no, I don't have a degree.
How did that, as you were getting started early, but I'd read some stuff about like getting grants and things like that it could be problematic until you landed a fellowship. But from peers, did you find, even though you were out there in the field and making these advances and finding these things out, did you find from your peers there was ever some pushback?
Oh, I think there was. I mean, obviously there was, but I didn't really pay much attention to it. I mean, paleontology to me is not like a career. It's just, it's what I would do for a hobby if I didn't get paid for it. So it didn't matter really to me how people reacted to it. I mean, I was just going to do my own thing, and that was all there was to it.
And I think, like I said, I think that's the attitude that I wanted to talk about some today as well, because I think that's an attitude maybe that more Americans should have, regardless of the field they're in.
Well, I think they have to really have a passion for it. So, I mean, it helps to really like it.
Let me jump in though too, as a foundation. I know in terms of science, it's finding this kind of consistent learning process. When you think of science and you think of your work in the field, because I read some where you were talking about a lot of the major museums will have dinosaurs, and to some degree, it sounded like you viewed them as almost trinkets if they had not done the complete scientific work of, cataloging where they had come from, analyzing the soils, etc. Why don't you talk about science just at a ground level and how it drives and governs your daily life?
Well, first off, science is a process. I mean, it's not something. It's how we do things, and basically, it's the process of coming up with some kind of an idea usually based on some experience or reading something or having found something, put together a hypothesis based on physical evidence, and then, just trying to find evidence that it's wrong, trying to falsify it. And after, some period of time that you think is satisfactory, that you attempted to find what could be wrong with it, and you put it out there for other people to attempt to falsify. I mean, science, that's what science is to me. I mean, it is just this process of trying to figure out what is real, what for me, what all these dinosaurs are doing for a living. And I run my whole life like that. That's not the only way to figure out what's true and what isn't.
Why don't I let you use an example that, and if you can comment on why maybe you thought you were one of the first people to think like this, that'd be interesting too. But just the process of breaking open dinosaur eggs, and that you were pretty, not cavalier when I heard you describe it, but you were like, hey, let's see what's inside. And other people like, oh, let's hold on. We can't do that. The dinosaur eggs, we can't break them open. You're like, hey, hold on. We got to find out what's in there.
Well, I think that a lot of that comes from, I blame that on my dyslexia. Reading, as far as I'm concerned, is overrated because people end up reading books and papers and getting everyone else's ideas of things clogged up in their heads. And so, people think that dinosaur eggs are precious because someone else has told them that they're precious. But, when it comes right down to it, the most exciting thing that an egg could produce is an embryo inside of it. To me, it makes perfectly good sense that if you have an egg, you break it open. Glue is cheap. You can always just glue it back together. There's nothing in it. It boggles my mind. And I have a student right now. I have a student who is looking at some dinosaur eggs that I collected a number of years ago that I didn't break open yet. And he's fighting with this whole thing. He says, I want to CAT scan it. I want to X-ray it. I want to put it through a synchrotron. He says, I know you're going to break it, but I want to see if we can do it without damaging it first. And I'm like, okay, have at it, but, breaking it open isn't damaging it. It's just like, breaking open a bone to look at the bone histology. There's more information usually inside something than there is outside something. And it's just, why everyone doesn't think that way is beyond me.
But maybe you attribute that some to dyslexia.
Well,
that way of thinking.
Yeah, I think us dyslexics are very spatial thinkers. And dysspasios, by definition, are people who are more linear thinkers.
Well, this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, because I definitely don't exist in the linear world. Nothing in my world has been linear at all. And so listen, I grew up with chickens. My father, we were in the suburbs in Virginia, but he grew up on a farm and he had all kinds of chickens. We would sit there with the manuals and order the crazy looking Polish game hens and all that kind of stuff. Is that what it was like 65 million years ago? Did these big old dinosaurs look in some ways like these crazy colorful chickens with feathers everywhere?
Well, more than likely. Certainly the smaller dinosaurs, especially the smaller meat-eating dinosaurs, were probably very feathered and very colorful. Yes. Dinosaurs, are reptiles and therefore diurnal animals. In other words, they live in the daytime, as opposed to nocturnal animals like mammals. For the most part, mammals are nocturnal. At least they evolved as nocturnal creatures, and therefore that's why they're not colorful. Mammals communicate with pheromones, with scent. That's why they sniff one another. birds and dinosaurs and reptiles all are diurnal and therefore communicate visually. That's why we would expect birds, dinosaurs, to be very feathered and colorful.
In growing up around chickens, one of the things that I noticed was behavior, especially if you're around them for an extended period of time. And in behavior down to the individual bird, personality wise, and some birds can be extremely friendly and almost would act not like chickens. They would act like dogs. They would become so friendly. And then some of those big old roosters would be like, alphas that would come after you. I mean, they were going to defend their territory no matter what, even if you were, 20 times their size. Have you thought about, I'm sure you have, but dinosaur behavior, do you think it mimicked some of that type of behavior where there'd be such different personalities?
Well, I actually studied dinosaur behavior, but I don't study it at that level. I mean, all we really have are their skeletons and, their eggs and nests and things like that. So, it's just not possible to get,
it's guessing
a sense of what the animal is like from a skeleton.
Let me jump into a couple big picture things that you are kind of known for that I think my audience would really find interesting. And I think one of a couple big topics here that you've talked about quite extensively. But I think number one, maybe if you could give me the condensed version talking about shape-shifting dinosaurs and maybe even use the Triceratops Torosaurus example and what you learned there and how you had to essentially bring new information to the paleontology world that might not want to accept your findings.
Well, the shape-shifting dinosaur hypotheses, basically come out of just studying lots and lots and lots of dinosaurs in lots and lots and lots of different rock formations, and realizing that at given levels of time, in other words, go back and look at, say, a particular stratigraphic horizon, what we would, identify as a time horizon. We were finding a lot of dinosaurs that looked different from one another, but were obviously very closely related. In the past, people were looking at those different dinosaurs and saying, well, they're related, but they're related by, some of them are more primitive and some are more derived evolutionarily. And, as a spatial thinker, my first question would be, well, how do we know that they're not just juveniles and adults? I mean, why would we sort them out evolutionarily rather than ontogenetically? And ontogeny is growth. So I knew that, that we knew even then, even when I started thinking about this, we knew that dinosaurs, juveniles and adults, do look different, just like birds do. Bird babies look different than adult birds. Their skulls look different. And this had been shown with some dinosaurs back in the 70s. And so the question was just, the whole point was just to test that hypothesis, a hypothesis that they were growth series rather than an evolutionary series. And the way to test it was looking inside their bones at their bone histology and determining whether they were juvenile, whether the ones that people were saying were primitive, the ones that I would hypothesize were juveniles, actually had juvenile bone. So we cut them open and looked, and sure enough, the ones that we were hypothesizing were juveniles actually had juvenile bone. They were young animals. And so we were able to, so that provided evidence for the hypothesis that is now testable. With Triceratops, this is one of the animals that we're hypothesizing, Triceratops as the sort of the younger growth stages. Well, still Triceratops, but what people used to think of as Torosaurus. Torosaurus and Triceratops are found in the same age sediments. They lived at the same time. And some people, a lot of people have always thought they were two different animals. And it's fine. I mean, I don't have any problem with them being two different animals as long as they're two different animals. But Torosaurus specimens are all bigger than Triceratops specimens, and there are no juveniles. So we cut into the Triceratops specimens, all the Triceratops specimens that we have, which is a lot of them. We've collected more than 100 of them, and they're all juvenile. I mean, they're all not juvenile, but they're at least subadult. And all the Torosaurus specimens we have, which we have 4 of them, are all adult. They're all full grown. They're all have very mature bone, whereas Triceratops specimens are all still growing. So it allows us to hypothesize that Torosaurus and Triceratops are the same animal and that they're just growth stages.
See, I love it. I mean, I've seen you talk about it, but I just think for the audience the type of thinking and you can maybe elaborate here, but I remember you giving an example, and I think you were having a debate with maybe a researcher professor at an Ivy League institution, and I think you were debating this very issue, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and then he was essentially saying, no, and you essentially countered with like, well, but hold on. And you said, hey, I've got this whole army of dinosaurs I'm working with, and you basically have a handful.
Right. Yeah. And the handful that they have was specimens collected back in the late 1800s and early 1900s that have no data with them. So we don't even know what geologic layers they came from. And so we have 100 new specimens of Triceratops, all with incredible amounts of data with them. So we know, which ones actually did live together and which ones didn't.
I wonder, do you think if you did it, you talked about, I think you said you were 6, you either found a dinosaur bone or saw your first one, you fell in love. Somebody eventually would have gone down your path if Jack Horner didn't do it. Maybe it might not be for another 100 years. But I mean, do you ever think about the fact that some of these things that you're figuring out, other people just have not yet figured out? I think it's got to be a cool feeling to kind of have those aha moments.
Well, it is. I mean, it's interesting. I just, like I keep saying, I just don't understand why other people don't. I mean, it's puzzling to me why people don't break eggs open or cut bones open and see how old they are. I mean, I don't know. It's just puzzling to me.
Listen, I brought it up in the beginning, and I maybe I'll let you, and then we'll talk about a couple things on the way out, but maybe I'll let you explain Chickosaurus, because I think as I brought it at the beginning, some people might be like, what is he talking about? But it essentially starts with you looking inside eggs and seeing that at a certain point in time, inside a dinosaur egg and inside a chicken egg look nearly identical. Is that a fair statement?
Well, not exactly. No. I mean,
you run with it.
The whole Dino Chicken project started with a couple of things. First off, my friend Hans Larsen was interested in how dinosaurs gave rise to birds. And I, at the same time, was actually looking at dinosaur development from babies and eggs to adulthood, was interested in development. So I had this interest in development. Hans Larsen, who works at McGill, was also interested in development, but he was looking at development from a genetic point of view. In other words, he was interested in what genes actually were involved, or what potential genes were involved to change a dinosaur into a bird. So he was looking he was looking for, what processes might be involved in reducing the tail or transforming the arms to wings. And he and I got to talking, and I said, I've always wanted to have a dinosaur, a live one. If you can find these genes, we should be able to just reverse the whole order of things and create one. In other words, retro-engineer a bird into a dinosaur. And that was, several years ago. And so we started working together, and we haven't accomplished that yet. We found an awful lot of genes that do an awful lot of things. And we even possibly found the genes that are responsible for making the tail short. I can't really tell you too much about where we are exactly right now with that, because obviously I want to publish it. Our group wants to publish it before someone else does. So we do have a few secrets, but
the big picture that you have talked about, you've talked about the idea of locating the gene for teeth, locating the gene that instead of fusing to a wing, those three fingers stay there, and then extending the tail out. So you've talked about that pretty openly.
Yeah. Well, there's three different ways of actually. So working with Hans sort of led me to this whole business of trying to make a dinosaur, and so I hired a couple of postdocs, and we're working on it. And there's three different ways that it's possible to make one. One is through transgenics. In other words, taking genes out of one animal and putting them in another, and attempting to, say, for example, get a alligator tail to grow on a bird. In other words, using different genes. Another way, and the way that I've been talking about mostly, is atavistic genes. In other words, ancestral genes, and turning them back on. So as we know, human beings, every once in a while, are born with a tail. And we're born with a tail because our ancestors, somewhere down the line in our ancestors, we had tails. And so the genetic pathway for a tail is still present in humans. And so every once in a while, a child will get a short little tail, and the doctor usually amputates it, takes it off. Well, birds do as well. So every once in a while, birds are born with a tail. Every once in a while, they're born with teeth, rare as hen's teeth. Every once in a while, they're even born with a three-fingered hand rather than a wing. And so those atavistic genes are still there. So the pathway is still there. And a fellow named Matthew Harris at the University of Wisconsin actually found that atavistic gene for teeth in birds, and so was able to produce a chicken with first-generation teeth. They didn't erupt into the beak, but at least they were growing inside the jaw. The enamel gene has been lost, so we know that the teeth won't be like dinosaur teeth with enamel on them, but we could introduce that back transgenically. So what we're basically looking for are the genes responsible for the tail and the hands now, and we're making some progress. The third way to actually make a dinosaur would actually be true genetic engineering. In other words, changing DNA. And that, probably will be possible someday, but that's certainly not 10 years off. That's many decades off.
So ultimately, though, if you and I are just chatting over a beer or something, ultimately this is all about, and I think we have the same desire. I would love to see dinosaurs walk again.
Yep, absolutely.
So let me ask. So let's say we get the Chickosaurus, we can get these three things back to it. I'm sure you've thought about this. I've just started to think about it. But let's say that Chickasaurus, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. Let's say we get the Chickasauruses out there and they've got teeth and they've got hands. I guess evolution could start to take over again to some degree because they might want to eat a little meat then. They might get a little bit bigger. Is that a fair assumption?
Well,
is this the way you're coming at it, Jack?
When we're, that would be down the line. That would be when we would have to manipulate DNA. To make atavistic dinosaurs, we would be making them one at a time because basically we're turning on and turning off genes in an embryo. So that embryo would grow up being a dino chicken or a chickenosaurus. But if it mated with a bird, it would still be back to being a bird again because we're not changing DNA. We're just turning on genes. So in order to get them to evolve, we literally do have to change their DNA.
So as the guy that has been a technical consultant for all the Jurassic Park films, and I think everyone pretty much knows that the way that it happened in the films isn't going to be the way that it's going to happen. And I think a lot of people then assumed it'll never happen. And you're saying, we're going to get there someday and somehow.
Oh, we are going to get there. Well, there's no question about that. We're closing in on ways to alter the way animals look drastically. So.
I've told a lot of friends that haven't seen your TED videos. I've said to them that they got to check them out. And they said, well, why would you want to bring dinosaurs back? That's frightening. And I said, no, this would be awesome. This would be awesome because then when you go to get your Starbucks latte, you have to carry a firearm or something. And they said, well, they said people are going to get killed. I said, no, it's natural selection. Don't worry. The good people will survive. Right? Is this?
Well,
you're not allowed to comment on this.
We have cats and dogs running around and we don't have to shoot them. I mean, it's meat-eating dinosaurs. Even if that's what they are, animals are not like we see them in movies.
Yeah. Well, you made the comment too. I saw you make the comment about that if it was in real life, I guess this would have been in the first film, the dinosaurs would have not raced into the building chasing the people. They would have gone for the dying Triceratops.
Of course they would. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, they only chase people in movies.
What were some of the things that you took out of that experience and being involved with the films? What was the most accurate? Because I've seen you talk about the inaccuracy, but what were the most accurate aspects of the films?
Well, I don't know that I can answer that. In all the model making are the attempts from the model makers and the computer graphics people to make the dinosaurs look as good as they possibly can. I mean, they really do. They are as accurate as our scientific information at the time was. So, just the way the dinosaurs look. Now, we know now that they would look different, but for the time they were as accurate as they could be. We know now that Tyrannosaurus probably had some fuzz on them or some feathers on them, and we know that all the raptors would be feathered. The duck-billed dinosaurs and those other kinds of dinosaurs, they're probably pretty accurate in themselves. Well, I think we'll discover that there's some additions, just like your chickens have wattles and combs and things like that. I think we're going to see a lot. There was a comb discovered recently on a duck-billed dinosaur, and I think we're going to find a lot more of them. So a lot of soft tissue extra parts I think we're going to see. But when Jurassic Park came out in 1993, the dinosaurs in it were as accurate as they could possibly be based on the science we had at the time.
Let me ask about T-Rex. this is like, and I'm still a little kid for all intents and purposes, but I think for all little kids, you just love the T-Rex, but it's different than what we grew up with as little kids thinking about it. And I think the primary way, and you talk about being your love of studying dinosaur behavior, but I think you've done a lot of work in figuring out, and I'm sure other people have been involved too, but scavenger, not predator.
Yeah, that's an argument that I made many years ago. Even wrote a book about it. And the whole reason, it was basically trying to get people away from their preconceived ideas. And so it goes back to this whole reading business. People have read about T-Rex and about how scary it was and how big it was, and it all come to the conclusion that it was a predator without actually looking at the evidence for it. And basically all I was just sort of the devil's advocate who said, what's the evidence for T-Rex being a predator? And everybody's like, I don't know, it's scary looking, so therefore it's a predator. And I said, well, let's evaluate it from a different perspective. Let's compare a Tyrannosaurus Rex and a Velociraptor and the skeleton. Just look at the skeletons of the two of them. You see that they're just very different from one another. T-Rex has tiny little arms. The Velociraptor has good, long, grasping arms. And the leg proportions of a T-Rex and a Velociraptor are very different. The T-Rex has a long femur and a shorter tibia, whereas the thigh bone to shin bone ratio. You look at a Velociraptor or any bird, and they have a really short femur and a longer tibia, and that gives you an idea how fast the animal could run. And Velociraptor could really rip along, and T-Rex couldn't hardly walk at all or hardly run at all. Probably, had nothing more than a fast walk. T-Rex has a huge olfactory lobe for the sense of smell, and we can associate that with turkey vultures as opposed to bloodhounds. Bloodhounds can smell things very close, tell whether you were in a room the day before. And turkey vultures can smell something 25 miles away. And T-Rex has the kind of olfactory lobe we see in these birds, and not in the animal that can track. So, it's just one piece of evidence after another that suggested that T-Rex was probably an opportunistic scavenger rather than a predator. Certainly more of a scavenger than a top predator. And also now we know that they're pretty common. I mean, they're common in their ecosystem. And if we compare that to, say, if we look at the Serengeti and we add up all the lions and the cheetahs and the leopards, that number is still smaller than the number of opportunistic, like wildebeest. I mean, not wildebeest, but hyenas. Hyenas outnumber all of them put together. And T-Rex comes out that sort of same way. It comes out way outnumbering all the other little predatory dinosaurs, which suggests that it is doing something very different, and that very different would be being an opportunist.
I think if people are listening to the way you think, you could be digging into any subject with the way you approach dinosaurs. And so what I like is the devil's advocate stance and the idea of making comparisons. So if you don't mind, if I can get you to reflect, but where did you become this it must have started at a young age where you would think about these comparisons or the digging process. I like to say in my world, I like to dig constantly, but this devil's advocate stance, because the system, the establishment never really cares for the devil's advocate, so to speak. And I know you really don't care what they care about you, but still you have to navigate life, so to speak. And you've done a good job at that, obviously, but where did you start to have this way of thinking, this outsider stance?
I'm probably born this way. I don't know. I don't remember ever thinking any differently.
It wasn't it wasn't learned. You just were always this way.
Right. Things just have to make sense to me. And if they don't, then, I do a lot of challenging of the status quo.
Do you find
because a lot of the status quo didn't make any sense to me.
Well, that kind of sums up my career too. The status quo just is usually the status quo. There's a lot of reasons why they're the status quo, and they often don't make a lot of sense. That's for sure.
That's right.
Well, so listen, if anybody wanted to find out more about you, possibly get involved, possibly help out the process of letting you bring dinos back to life, where can they reach out and find more information about you, Jack?
Probably on our website, Museum of the Rockies website.
Okay.
I don't know, Museum of the Rockies.
They'll find you.
Or something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, listen, I appreciate you taking the time today. I know it's a slightly different audience in my world, but I know a lot of people I just thought that the way that you've approached things, the thinking, the comparing, the digging, the science, it's a very clear way of thinking. Every time I've seen your presentations on TED and the live presentation I saw, very clear. It makes you wonder why the status quo is so comfortable with being so unclear.
That's a good question. If you can answer that.
We won't.
I don't know that would help, though. I don't know that they're going to change.
Well, yeah, everyone's got a fiefdom to protect, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. But hey, well, listen, Jack. Hopefully, we can talk again in the future, and I appreciate you taking the time today.
You're very welcome.
My guest today is Brett Steenbarger. Brett is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the State University in New York, Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York. He has written, I think he's working on his 4th book now. Tons of papers out there. He's got a great blog that you have to check out. Works also as a performance coach for hedge funds, proprietary trading firms. A really interesting guy. Definitely check out his blog. Hope you enjoy this conversation. Hey, Brett.
How you doing?
Good. Before I'm calling you today, I'm thinking to myself, have we spoken before? We've been communicating for probably a decade, but I couldn't recall if we had actually got on the phone before.
I don't think so. We obviously communicated about the book and shared some things that way, but I think this is the first in-person communication.
Where am I reaching you this fine day?
I'm at home sitting at the island in my kitchen with surrounded by 4 cats.
I see a cat on your Skype screen as well.
Exactly, my avatar. Yes, that's one of our 4.
Well, nice. Well, I also have a problem today as I started preparing to speak with you, and I'm like, oh my gosh, there are way too many directions we could go. There are too many issues you could cover. Even if I go through your blog for 5 minutes, I'm like, oh my God, I'm just making bullet points. I'm like, okay, we can go here, we can go here. So anyways, just the audience knows that I think you're from a 360 degree perspective. We can go just about anywhere in the trading world today. And I have some ideas. And the first thing I wanted to jump into, and I think you could offer a nice explanation to what it is and why it's important, is the idea of a flow state. And I saw you describe it as the optimal balance between the challenges we face and our level of talent and skill, the flow state. I started to think about Michael Jordan and being in the zone and that type of thing. Was I thinking right? Was that where you were headed with that? Why don't you explain that, the flow state?
I think that is a good analogy. And being in the zone in general, I think, is what people mean when they talk about a flow state. The flow concept was popularized by a psychologist, researcher, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he talked about states of consciousness in which people become fully and totally absorbed in what they are doing. They lose track of time, and during those states, he found not only do they feel most fulfilled, but they also report their most creative work. And he found in his studies that this state is most likely to occur when there is a match between the challenges of a task and the skill level of the individual, so that when we are challenged by something we enjoy doing, but not overwhelmed by it, we become fully absorbed. If we're insufficiently challenged, we become bored. If we're overly challenged, we become overwhelmed. And so he proposed that learning in any discipline is most likely to occur effectively if we can sustain a state of flow.
How have you seen this manifested in the trading world? What's a great example that might come to the tip of your brain right now that makes you say, this is a good example to kind of bring this idea and connect it to the trading world?
Well, one thing that you emphasized in your trend following book, Mike, was the idea of the importance of position sizing. And it's something that I find that many traders don't consider adequately. So, for instance, if a trader is taking too much risk on a trade for their ultimate level of emotional tolerance, then in fact they're creating a mismatch. The challenge of the P&L state overwhelms them, and so they can't remain in that flow state where they will optimally process market data. We're most likely to experience flow when we are not frustrated. And so if we set perfectionistic expectations that we won't experience whipsaws or we won't experience drawdowns, we set ourselves up for frustration that once again can nudge us out of that flow state.
Let me go into, you brought up risk, and let's talk about risk tolerance for a second. It's a topic, and so many people have come to me over the years and they want opinions on risk and how much to risk and this and that. If this is not how much you should risk in whatever trading approach you might be taking, of course, you can go too far to one side, and that's pretty easy, a mathematical certitude as to where you're going. But when you start to risk those small amounts, it's such a personal choice. And I'm curious to your views about how you have maybe got people to see the idea of risk selection, risk tolerance, because it's not a one size fits all.
No, and there are two facets of risk management. One is the logical side, and one is the psychological side. And in a purely logical sense, you can determine for a given Sharpe ratio or expected Sharpe ratio what kind of risk you would need to take in order to generate a particular target return. So, like you say, that's a fairly structured determination. The question is, on the logical side of how much risk one, quote unquote, should take, is that how much risk a person psychologically can tolerate? And an equally important question for the people I work with is that a level of risk that investors are ultimately willing to tolerate?
Well, that's a whole nother can of worms right there. And I'll let you.
It's a huge can of worms, Mike. Yeah. There is a tremendous mandate among investors to make money and not lose money. And the world is not exactly constructed that way. And so what happens is that a level of risk-taking may be appropriate for achieving a particular target return and may even fit with a person's psychological risk tolerance, but could fall outside of mandates of the owners of a firm, if it's a proprietary trading firm, or investors in the firm, and that can create conflict and problems. Many times I find that people are most able to manage capital effectively if their risk-taking is less than what might be optimal logically. That by minimizing drawdowns and containing them, they are able to maintain a psychological state closer to the flow state that works for them. And so many successful portfolio managers I've worked with are not high risk takers, but they end up being very consistent risk takers and achieve very good risk-adjusted returns.
Yeah, and I think it's tough, though. I think as we were bringing up the idea of investors, the no risk, no return, though, you have to put your foot outside the boat, so to speak. You can't just expect a return for not doing anything. Like, you've got to put some skin out there if you want some reward. And I think too many people, even astute institutional investors that maybe work with some of the largest, I'm thinking of some of the public pension funds that put a lot of money with assorted hedge funds around this world. I sometimes really wonder about their decision making and it seems to me, it looks like a political crapshoot in there, and often not the most astute investing decisions.
It can be political. It can be simply a function of cognitive bias. I think investors many times are attracted to recent returns. And so someone who's had a big year might be more likely to attract capital than someone who's had a more modest year, despite length of track record.
But we're also talking as we're just keeping this conversation going about institutional investors. These folks should be aware by now, for some of the largest funds out there in the world, where their alpha comes from. And so if you're looking at a broad section of markets and this particular trader has a fantastic year, it should not be such a surprise. I find in 2014 for astute institutional investors to still be moved by what have you done for me lately is kind of amazing. I'm just still shocked.
I would agree. And there's certainly more and less sophisticated investors. And again, this applies not just to quote unquote institutional investors, but really anyone who is allocating capital to someone for trading. So I see it happening within proprietary trading firms. I see it happening within hedge funds. I see it happening within CTAs. So I think there are many varieties of this, but it's very common to be drawn to eye-popping returns and overweight those and recent returns.
So I saw a quote on your site. I want to know why it was on there. It was in a list of quotations, famous people. Mario Andretti, if you have everything under control, you're not moving fast enough. I love it. I love it. What inspired you? What did you like about that?
Actually, that is, it's interesting you picked that up. That is one of my favorite quotes from the quotation selection from the blog recently. If you're not out of control, I mean, obviously, you can't be completely out of control in your trading and in your risk taking. However, we don't grow as people if we stay within our comfort zones. We have to push the envelope to some degree to expand our boundaries, to expand ourselves. And so I always want to be pushing, moving harder, moving faster, doing more, and pursuing opportunities that are uncertain, because those are the ones I find that lead to the greatest personal payoffs. If I'm feeling completely comfortable, completely in control in my personal life, then I probably am relatively stagnant.
How would you advise a client that maybe you see this in their behavior? They think they're still progressing, but they're too under control. They've almost lost that edge a little. How have you advised? How do you get people to kind of come around and maybe see that they might be stuck a little?
Yes, well, it gets back to that principle of what psychologists do, and that is comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. And I think there is an important role for afflicting the comfortable, that things are going well, and it's easy to take the eye off of the performance ball. And so what I will look for are occasions where, even within that comfort zone, a trader or a portfolio manager might be missing opportunities, might be performing suboptimally, and bring that to their attention. I act as a kind of mirror to the trader, and I hold that up in front of the trader. Take a look. Most of the professional traders I work with have enough of a competitive makeup and mindset that if you nudge them, if you put them in front of that mirror and help them show them that they are missing opportunities, that they are performing suboptimally, they often will pick up on that. But it takes that mirroring, it takes that nudge.
Do you find also, even for traders, and you've worked with significant traders in your career, significant achievement, do you find some traders, even though they might hire you and bring you in, and they want the straight talk, they don't want the airbrushed pretty pictures, do some of them still push back? Do some of them get to the point where they don't like that mirror?
Oh my goodness, yes. And I would go even further. There are some who really want the trading coach to augment or support their own confirmation bias. And so they don't want to hear what's uncomfortable. They're really looking for more of a cheerleader than a coach. And that becomes difficult. And there have been occasions where I've had to turn down coaching assignments simply because what the person was asking for would have required less than full integrity on my part.
Yeah, that I could see how that could happen for sure. Hey, interesting thought here. So I often see percentages. It'll say, well, 95% of traders lose, or entry is only 10% of the success, or often I will see this, that a very high percentage of trading comes down to the psychological component, 80, 90%. How do you see that when you start to see those percentages tossed around? What immediately comes to mind for you?
Well, what comes to mind is the distinction between what is necessary and what is sufficient. And I do believe that having a focused and disciplined mindset is necessary for trading success. I don't think it's sufficient. If discipline were all that were needed, or if a relatively emotionless mind state were all that were needed to succeed in trading, then probably there would never be any losing algorithmic trading systems. The computer doesn't have the emotions, and they execute flawlessly and in a disciplined fashion. And yet we all know that those can be overfit and not perform. So it takes focus, it takes discipline, but it takes something more. And that's commonly referred to as an edge in markets. You have to be trading patterns and concepts that reflect a true and objective positive expected return. And the idea that psychology is 90% of trading, maybe that's true once you have that objective edge. But it takes that objective edge in order to succeed.
So I was looking at that. I think I first saw it in a PDF from Michael Mauboussin, who used to be at Legg Mason, and it was a process versus outcome chart. And basically, a good process, good outcome is deserved. A good process, bad outcome is a bad break. A bad process and a good outcome is dumb luck. And a bad process and a bad outcome is poetic justice. Process versus outcome. I think there's so many folks, and we've already kind of talked about this a little bit without naming process versus outcome in the beginning of our conversation, but so many people are fixated on that outcome. That just love that outcome. That outcome looks so pretty to them. But boy, that process just gets lost in the shuffle, doesn't it?
Yes, and what happens during slump periods, we all know that there are going to be occasions, even with that edge, where there are a series of losing trades or there is a losing period in markets. People will begin to doubt themselves, doubt their methods, and will make random changes in their processes. And so the drawdown turns into a slump. It's like the baseball hitter who strikes out again, begins to doubt themselves, and now changes their swing and proceeds to have several games of poor performance. So I think it is important to distinguish between process and outcome and to be able to accept that at times there will be frustrating outcomes from very good processes, that we're not guaranteed success. Drawdowns are inevitable. As you emphasize in the book, I remember Ed Sakota talking about you can't repeal uncertainty from market outcomes. By accepting that and focusing on process, we can stay as true to whatever edge we have in markets as possible.
I've seen this over the years, and I don't know if you share the same perspective, but in speaking with so many different fund managers over the years, it sure seems like strategy is driven. Now, of course, in my world, I've seen many guys and ladies that have done very well as trend following traders. And then the clients come to them, they see those results and they want a part of it. That still doesn't make it easy for people to accept what goes along with that style of trading. But I think the biggest thing that I've heard in conversations over the years is clients and the in and out of flow of money really keeps even some of the best traders on edge. And frankly, the word that I want to use is worried.
Yes.
It's like, because I think they see those, it all comes down to, and I'm not saying this in a negative way, because there's many men and women that you and I respect who have made fantastic fortunes and made their clients lots of money with 2 and 20 type fee structures. But those fee structures carry a psychological burden, don't they?
They certainly can. And worry is really a two-edged sword. I've seen worry work in the favor of a trader in terms of keeping them prudent about risk management. And I've seen, and act as a brake on overconfidence biases. And I've seen worry act as one of those frustrations that take people out of the zone, out of that flow state. And it becomes particularly challenging when the worries of investors end up becoming the worries of trading firms and money managers.
Yeah, that defeats the whole purpose of why the investor actually wanted the expertise of that trader to begin with.
Yes, and I think your point is well taken, that it's one thing to intellectually accept a degree of uncertainty and potential drawdown from trading. It's another thing emotionally to accept that and to be in that drawdown state and be able to stick with a sound process.
Yeah. Okay, Brett, let me go trading 101 on you. Common characteristics of traders. What are some of those common characteristics that you've seen in your career, and just kind of laying out some nuts and bolts for the audience?
Common characteristics of successful traders. I would make important distinctions between short-term traders, and most notably day traders, and longer-term traders, most notably investors. There's a very worthwhile book that I'm sure you're aware of, Thinking, Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. And my experience is that Kahneman's ideas are important, that there's a large distinction, important distinction, a vital distinction between slow thinking, deep thinking, and fast thinking, quick pattern recognition. The shorter the time frame of the market participant, the more I see fast thinking and quick pattern recognition as essential to success. The more I see longer time frames and investing as important to the trader, the more I see the slow thinking, the deep thinking, the explicit analysis as important to success. And of course, there are hybrids, and there are people who I've known and worked with who have skills on both sides of that. But I think there are important skill differences between the short-term trader and the longer-term market participant. That being said, I do find some personality commonalities. One of the personality traits that is emphasized in your book and in the Big Five research, as it's called, is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is attentiveness to detail, process orientation, if you will, a sense of responsibility, and people who are high in conscientiousness, who are detail-oriented, who are very focused on responsibility, end up being more reliable followers of a particular edge or a particular system than people who are low in conscientiousness, who can be impulsive. Another dimension that ends up being relatively important is emotional stability, or sometimes the opposite, called neuroticism. People who are relatively steady in their emotional makeup versus people who have lots of emotional ups and downs. And it's easiest to make decisions under conditions of risk and uncertainty if your flight and fight responses aren't roiling. And what I found is that either successful traders have this emotionally steady, stable makeup, or they find some mechanisms to provide them with a high degree of conscientiousness so that they can be very detail-oriented and responsible. If they don't have their feet on the ground, if they aren't grounded in a state where they are relatively steady emotionally and relatively reliable in their performance, they often don't follow whatever talents or skills they may have with consistency. And that brings me to the last characteristic, and that is underscoring one of the findings from Jack Schwager's research. And that is that successful money managers are very different from one another in their personalities and in their trading styles. But we most often find that the successful money managers are trading in a fashion that is consistent with their personality strengths. They have some area of strength that they find a way to manifest, to express through their trading. And so the person who is quantitatively oriented and analytically skilled might have very different strengths than the person who has that fast thinking pattern recognition. But each finds a way through their trading to be who they are in terms of those strengths.
I've kind of an outside the box type question, and given your background and given the epidemic overuse and misuse of prescription drugs related to the mind, where are we headed in that place? It sure seems like that we've passed the threshold of those people that truly need medical help, and we're at a point where a lot of issues of the mind are being treated pharmaceutically. Are we in a good place in society?
Well, it's a really, really good question. As you know, I have an adjunct clinical faculty appointment at the medical school in Syracuse, New York, in the Department of Psychiatry. I'm a psychologist, a clinical psychologist myself by training, but work closely with my colleagues in the department in psychiatry. And I've really seen both sides of that issue. I've seen people with lifelong debilitating depression or anxiety disorders benefit tremendously from the appropriate medications. It really has turned their lives around. And I've seen people who have been overly quick to turn to pharmaceutical solutions when in fact other ways of dealing with behavioral problems, let's say, in children, could be found. And there are habit-forming medications that can be quite dangerous that end up being prescribed. I've seen this with the minor tranquilizers, the benzodiazepines, that people will take to calm themselves down or help themselves sleep. And on a very temporary basis, they can work, but used to excess over time, they create a very dangerous dependence.
Yeah. Hey, one more quote that I saw on your site that I love from Bob Knight. And here you are putting Bob Knight. A lot of people say you can't quote Bob Knight. Come on, Bob Knight. Your biggest opponent isn't the other guy. It's human nature. I love it.
Love it. And I am a Bob Knight fan. I admit it publicly and proudly. We all have our moments and we have our flaws. But, what I think Coach Knight really exemplified was the importance of teaching as a coach and the importance of preparation, the drive to not just win, but to prepare to win. And human nature is such that we like to avoid effort. We like comfort. And as I was mentioning before, we don't really grow. We don't expand, certainly not as a basketball player, unless we push our limits. And so human nature keeps us out of the gym. It keeps us away from practice. It keeps us from researching markets and from developing fresh sources of edge. And that's something that's important to push past.
It was kind of comparing the idea or contrasting or just getting people to think about two different strategies of trading, which is trend trading versus a mean reversion. And the floor is yours. Where did you want to go with that?
Well, it's really interesting because, to get back to our earlier point, many times traders and trading firms and investors have trouble tolerating drawdown. And so even though they may end up conceptualizing a macro market in terms of trend, they find themselves unable to fully participate in that trend and trade with that trend because the trend always involves some degree of retracement. And so what happens, ironically, is that people who will talk in terms of trend and think of their trades in terms of trend will end up trading in a way that looks more mean reverting, so to speak. And as a result, their participation in any trend that manifests is suboptimal. One of the cornerstones of just my own thinking about markets is a philosophical tradition called contextualism. Contextualism emphasizes that events are the result of context, of situations that we are in. And there are situations in markets that lead to more directional persistence, and there are situations in markets that lead to less persistence of direction. And we call those situations regimes. There are stable market periods in which patterns within markets will persist and then change with changing economic conditions, changing social conditions, and so forth. And so I like to think of trend not only in terms of price movement, but trend in terms of regime persistence. That a regime that we are in currently, if we identify a stable, real regime, that in the short run tends to persist. Now, that persistence of regime may or may not implicate directional persistence of price movement. You could have a mean reverting pattern that is part of a stable regime that itself will persist over time. And so the trend that you're trading in that situation is not trend of price movement, but trend of regime, if that makes sense. So from my perspective, trend following is a broader concept, a more encompassing concept, and a more important concept than simply whether markets will go up or down day after day after day.
Yeah, and I think you are perhaps inadvertently bringing up an even more important issue, which is definitions in the quote trading and market space. And I think maybe you and I should start this. We should find a URL and just call this is the agreed upon definitions. I don't think it would ever happen. But I mean, there's so many terms get tossed around with different meanings. And one of the ones that I've seen recently that's hotly debated is trend following and momentum trading getting put into the same camp. And now I'm having to go read some of those momentum papers to see exactly what they're talking about. So there's just a terrible amount of, I think we all want to be on the same page. We're not all trying to use different terms to confuse each other. But I think there is a heck of a lot of confusion out there.
Yes, and a hell of a lot of emotional attachment to terms like momentum or terms like value. And the discussions end up being more ones of ideological affiliation than real understanding.
Yeah. This is true. Well, I mean, somebody could criticize my world and say you do that for trend following. What I have tried to do, though, is find particular traders that often weren't associated with each other, trading in similar ways, making lose money in the same months, which I thought was terribly unique data to have and to analyze. I think sometimes with bigger terms like value, you could say, well, Warren Buffett is a value trader and Seth Klarman, but these guys don't behave necessarily the same way. So it's a little bit trickier with some of the broader terms, I think.
Well, you're raising a great point, Mike, and that is that how people actually behave and how they describe their behavior can be very, very different things. And that's the bedevilment of every psychologist. Yeah. That when you really investigate what people do, this is true in the psychotherapy research. When you look at what people do as opposed to what they say they do, you see some very important differences. There's a whole tradition in psychotherapy called an integration perspective, in which they look at what the common characteristics are of good therapies. So if you look at successful therapists, what are they doing in common? Even though some might say they're a behaviorist and some might say they're a Freudian and some might say they're a humanist, what are they doing similarly that might account for their positive outcomes? And it turns out there are common effective ingredients of therapies. And I suspect, as you're alluding, that that's true for trading as well.
I've seen people that want to describe themselves as in certain terms, and they're very honest and accurate. And then other traders that just don't want to use the term that would best describe them. And I often just figure it's for client purposes or marketing purposes because it's clear they're doing what they say they're not doing.
Right.
Yeah. Hey, Brett, where's the best place for people to check you out, follow along? You've got some really cool posts, motivational type things also as well on your blog. Where's the best place for people to go beyond Amazon where they can buy books? And you are working on the 4th book. Is that?
Yes, working on the 4th book, also with Wiley. But the Trader Feed blog, TraderFeed, traderfeed.blogspot.com, is really where I post day-to-day ideas and share and use as a kind of sketch pad for the ideas that end up going into the books that I write.
Yeah, I think for guys like me and you that have been online for a long time, we do something similar in that. I call Facebook and Twitter my own personal diaries. I don't necessarily even care that other people like it or whatever. It's whatever interests me and how I want to keep track of things, and that's how I use it.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. One of the areas of research that fascinates me is creativity and the role of creativity in successful trading. And the thinking aloud process, talking aloud, writing, thinking aloud, processing information explicitly, and then reading over or listening to what you have said ends up being one of the techniques that can lead to fresh perspectives and creative outcomes.
Yeah, I feel fortunate to have started this podcast 2 years in and several hundred episodes. And I'm lucky in talking to you and so many other people that have come on. It's like going to a never ending school with very, very bright people. It's quite fun.
Yeah, it's fun, and it's a tremendous resource that you've assembled. And there are some really top people there, over 230 podcasts I noticed. And think of each podcast as a kind of prism. You're putting on a different set of lenses, so to speak, so that you're seeing the world from a different angle. And eventually, with enough good people giving you enough good lenses, you start to see some fresh angles, some fresh directions. That's what leads to those creative insights and promising directions in trading or in other areas of life.
Yeah, I think you're spot on about that. I think you're spot on. Getting fresh perspectives and different perspectives, not just necessarily the same voices, and listening to different people say it, maybe a common or even a dissimilar. Just listening to different people explain themselves, their cadence, their tone. I mean, I'm still the same guy, but I get to hear all these different ways. It's fascinating. I love it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, Brett, listen, hopefully we can talk again in the future, and thank you for coming on today. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, and good luck in your future podcasts.
Thanks, sir. Talk soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.